It was a busy Monday morning at Atlanta International Airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to their gates, the sound of rolling suitcases against the floor mixing with announcements echoing through the speakers. Dr. Marcus Johnson walked calmly through the chaos. At 45, he carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark suit was pressed perfectly, though he had loosened his tie after a long weekend. The small pin on his lapel, marking him as a member of the American Medical Association, caught the light as he moved. Marcus checked his watch. Flight 2187 to Los Angeles would begin boarding in 20 minutes. He had just enough time to grab a coffee before heading to the gate. The past 3 days had been exhausting. The medical conference where he presented his groundbreaking research on pediatric brain surgery had drained him completely. All he wanted now was to get home to his wife and children. "Large black coffee, please," he told the barista at the airport cafe. Coffee in hand, Marcus made his way to gate C12. He had paid extra for a first-class ticket, something he rarely did, but after such a demanding weekend, he needed the comfort and space to review his notes before meeting with the hospital board tomorrow. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 2187 to Los Angeles, the gate agent announced. Marcus joined the short line, boarding pass and ID ready. When his turn came, he smiled at the agent who scanned his ticket. "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Johnson," she said with a friendly nod. The jetway was crowded with flight attendants preparing for the boarding process. Marcus nodded politely as he entered the plane, turning left toward the first-class cabin. It was a newer aircraft with spacious seats arranged in pairs. Marcus found his seat -3A, a window seat, and placed his leather briefcase in the overhead bin before settling in. The seat was wide and comfortable. He let out a small sigh of relief as he sat down. More passengers filed in, the first-class cabin filling quickly with business travelers in suits and expensive casual wear. Marcus took out his phone to send a quick text to his wife, letting her know he was boarding on time. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff, sir?" a flight attendant asked the passenger across the aisle. "Just water, thank you," the man replied. Marcus put his phone on airplane mode and closed his eyes for a moment. The lack of sleep from the weekend was catching up to him. "Excuse me." Marcus opened his eyes to see a flight attendant standing over him. Her name tag read Rebecca Wilson. She was in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back tightly in a bun. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Yes," Marcus responded with a tired smile. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Rebecca's tone was crisp, professional, but with an edge that made Marcus sit up straighter. Of course, he reached for his phone, where he had saved his digital boarding pass, and showed it to her. Rebecca looked at the screen, then back at Marcus. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked. "This is the first-class cabin," Rebecca said, loud enough that passengers nearby turned to look. "Yes, I know. I have a first-class ticket." Marcus pointed to the seat assignment clearly displayed on his boarding pass. Rebecca didn't move. She looked around the cabin, then back at Marcus. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" "3A?" Her voice had a doubtful tone that made something sink in Marcus's stomach. "Yes, I'm sure," he said firmly but politely. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" The other passengers were watching now. An uncomfortable silence fell over the front of the plane. What happened next would change everything. Rebecca Wilson stood beside seat 3A, her posture stiff as she looked down at Marcus Johnson. "Sir, there seems to be some confusion," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet first-class cabin. "Could I see your boarding pass again?" Marcus showed her his phone once more, pointing directly at the seat assignment. 3A, first class. "As you can see, this is my assigned seat." Rebecca frowned, looking unconvinced. She tapped the screen of his phone. "Sometimes the app glitches," she explained, though no one had ever mentioned such a glitch to Marcus before. "Let me check the system." She pulled out a small tablet from her pocket and began typing. The passengers nearby watched with growing interest. A middle-aged white businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows but said nothing. "Our system shows seat 3A is reserved for a Dr. Marcus Johnson," Rebecca said finally, looking up from her tablet. "That's me," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm Dr. Marcus Johnson." Rebecca blinked, her expression shifting slightly. "You're a doctor?" "Yes, I'm a neurosurgeon at Los Angeles Memorial. I was in Atlanta for a medical conference. A flash of something, doubt perhaps, crossed Rebecca's face, but she quickly masked it. Do you have any identification with your medical credentials? Marcus felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. He was aware of all the eyes on him now. The cabin had grown completely silent. I don't typically carry my medical license when I travel, he explained. But I do have my driver's license, which confirms my name. He reached for his wallet and handed her his ID. Rebecca examined it closely, then looked back at him. I see, she said, her tone unchanged. Well, there still seems to be an issue with your seat assignment. Our premium cabin has certain standards. The implication hung in the air. A woman a few rows back gasped softly. Marcus felt his heart beating faster, but his face remained calm, a skill learned from years in high-pressure operating rooms. I'm not sure what standards you're referring to. I paid for this seat. Rebecca leaned closer, lowering her voice. Sir, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy class. We can sort this out after takeoff. I don't want to move to economy, Marcus replied, his voice firm but level. This is my assigned seat. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay in departure. Rebecca straightened up, looking annoyed at the interruption. Sir, we need to complete boarding. I must ask you to gather your things and move to economy class until we can resolve this issue. An older woman sitting behind Marcus spoke up. Excuse me, but if his ticket says first class, why should he move? Rebecca turned to the woman with a tight smile. Ma'am, I'm handling this situation. Airline policy gives us discretion in seating arrangements. What policy is that? Marcus asked. Rebecca's face hardened. Sir, I need you to comply. You're delaying the flight for everyone. The pressure of all eyes on him, the implied threat of causing trouble, weighed heavily on Marcus. As a black man, he had learned early in life which battles to fight and when. Making a scene on an airplane rarely ended well for someone who looked like him. Fine, he said quietly. To avoid delaying everyone's flight, I'll move temporarily. He gathered his briefcase from the overhead bin. A flight attendant from economy class had appeared at the front, looking confused about the situation. Marcus walked past Rebecca, his face carefully blank despite the humiliation burning inside him. Seat 24C is open, Rebecca called after him, loud enough for everyone to hear. As Marcus made his way to the back of the plane, he heard murmurs from other passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, a few openly disapproving of Rebecca's actions. In economy class, a young flight attendant named Michael approached him. Sir, can I help you find your seat? Apparently, it's 24C now, Marcus replied, the words bitter in his mouth. Michael looked confused. But your boarding pass is for first class, Marcus finished. Yes, I know. What neither of them realized was that another passenger had recognized Marcus, and she was already typing a message on her phone. The economy cabin was packed. Every middle seat was filled, and the aisle was cramped with passengers still finding their spots. Marcus made his way to 24C, a middle seat wedged between two strangers. The space was a far cry from the comfortable first-class seat he had paid for. Excuse me, Marcus said politely to the heavyset man in the aisle seat. I need to get to the middle. The man sighed heavily but stood up, barely making enough room for Marcus to squeeze past. As Marcus settled into the tight middle seat, he could feel the tension in his shoulders building. Weren't you just in first class? Asked the woman by the window, a young professional with curly hair and glasses. Marcus nodded. Yes, there was a misunderstanding. The woman frowned. I saw what happened. That wasn't right. Marcus gave a small shrug, not wanting to discuss it further. He had faced similar situations before, being questioned, doubted, asked to prove he belonged in spaces where people didn't expect to see someone who looked like him. It wasn't new, but it never stopped being painful. Up in first class, conversations had broken out among the passengers. Did you see that? Whispered a businessman to his colleague. That guy had a first-class ticket. I saw it on his phone. An older woman shook her head disapprovingly. That flight attendant should be ashamed. Rebecca Wilson moved through the first-class cabin, offering pre-flight drinks as if nothing unusual had happened. But she noticed the changed atmosphere, the cool responses, the avoided eye contact from several passengers. Meanwhile, in row 18, a woman named Sophia Chen was typing rapidly on her phone. As a journalist for a major news outlet, she recognized Dr. Marcus Johnson immediately. Just last month, she had read about his groundbreaking surgical technique that saved the life of a 5-year-old girl with an inoperable brain tumor. "You won't believe what I'm witnessing," she typed to her editor. Dr. Marcus Johnson, yes, that Dr. Johnson, just got kicked out of first class for no apparent reason except that he's black. I'm on the same flight. Her editor's response came quickly. "Get details. This could be big." The plane began taxiing toward the runway. Marcus tried to focus on reviewing his notes for tomorrow's meeting, but the cramped conditions made it difficult. His knees pressed against the seat in front, and each time his elbows brushed against his neighbors, he had to apologize. In the first-class galley, Michael, the young flight attendant who had helped Marcus find seat 24C, approached the lead flight attendant, James Carter. "James, there's something strange going on," Michael said in a low voice. "That passenger Rebecca moved to economy. His boarding pass was definitely for first class. I saw it myself." James frowned. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Seat 3A, now it's empty up there." James glanced toward Rebecca, who was arranging glasses on her cart. "Let me look into it." As the plane reached cruising altitude, Sophia in row 18 continued her discreet documentation. She snapped a photo of the empty first-class seat, then one of Dr. Johnson squeezed uncomfortably in economy. The contrast was striking. Marcus tried to concentrate on his breathing, a technique he used during long surgeries. In the operating room, he was respected, revered even. His opinions weren't questioned. His presence wasn't suspicious. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that performed delicate brain surgeries were now folded awkwardly in his lap, trying to take up as little space as possible. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, announcing that service would begin shortly. Marcus closed his eyes, wishing the 4-hour flight would pass quickly. He didn't notice James, the lead flight attendant, walking slowly through the cabin, looking at seat numbers. Nor did he see James stop and speak quietly to Sophia, whose eyes widened as she showed him something on her phone. And he certainly didn't see Rebecca's face pale as James returned to the galley and showed her a webpage on his tablet. A webpage featuring a photograph of Dr. Marcus Johnson receiving an award for medical excellence from the President of the United States. The truth was about to come out, and the remaining hours of Flight 2187 would be unlike anything anyone had expected. James Carter stood in the galley, his tablet displaying Dr. Marcus Johnson's impressive biography. The screen showed multiple images. Marcus in surgical scrubs, Marcus receiving awards, Marcus speaking at medical conferences. A quick search had revealed that Dr. Johnson wasn't just any doctor. He was one of the nation's top neurosurgeons who had pioneered a revolutionary technique for removing brain tumors. "Rebecca," James said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "do you realize who that man is?" Rebecca's face drained of color as she looked at the tablet. I was just following protocol. His ticket seemed. His ticket was valid." James cut her off. "Michael confirmed it. You moved a first-class passenger with a legitimate ticket to economy without any justification." The reality of what she had done was sinking in. Rebecca swallowed hard. "We need to fix this," James continued. "Now." In economy class, Marcus was trying to review his presentation notes despite the cramped conditions. The woman beside him, noticing his struggle, offered him more elbow room. "Are you a doctor?" she asked, pointing to a medical journal that had slipped from his briefcase. Marcus nodded. "Yes, I'm a neurosurgeon." The woman's eyes widened. "Wait, are you Dr. Marcus Johnson? The one who developed the microvascular technique for pediatric brain tumors?" Surprised at being recognized, Marcus smiled modestly. "Yes, that's me. My niece was treated with your technique last year at Children's Hospital in Boston," the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved her life." Their conversation caught the attention of nearby passengers. A man across the aisle leaned forward. "Dr. Johnson, I saw your TED talk about medical innovations. It was brilliant." Others began to turn in their seats. The quiet murmurs spread through the economy section as more people realized who was sitting among them. Marcus, unused to such public recognition, felt uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Meanwhile, Sophia Chen had been documenting everything. Her social media posts about the incident were gaining traction rapidly. Hashtag Flight Injustice was already trending on several platforms. Dr. Marcus Johnson, who saved countless children with his surgical innovations, was removed from first class on Flight 2187 despite having a valid ticket, she had written. Would this have happened if he didn't look the way he does? Her posts included images of the empty first-class seat and Dr. Johnson crammed into economy. The airline's name was clearly visible. At the front of the plane, James and Rebecca were deep in discussion when Michael approached them. You both need to see this, he said, showing them his phone. Sophia's posts had already been shared thousands of times, with comments flooding and expressing outrage at the airline's treatment of Dr. Johnson. This is getting out of control, James said, scrolling through the angry comments. We need to fix this situation immediately. He turned to Rebecca. You're going to apologize to Dr. Johnson and escort him back to his rightful seat in first class. Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. But what if he complains to the company? I could lose my job. You should have thought about that before you moved him without cause, James replied firmly. Now go. As Rebecca reluctantly made her way toward economy class, the atmosphere in the plane had shifted dramatically. Passengers were pointing and whispering. Some had their phones out, recording everything. Marcus, still in his cramped middle seat, was now surrounded by admiring passengers. A young medical student had recognized him from a lecture and was asking about career advice. Others simply wanted to express their gratitude for his work. The buzz of conversation suddenly hushed as Rebecca appeared at the end of the aisle. All eyes turned to her as she slowly made her way toward seat 24C, her face rigid with discomfort. She stopped beside Marcus, aware that dozens of passengers were watching and listening. Some had their phones pointed directly at her, recording every moment. Dr. Johnson, she began, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. There's been a mistake. We'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class. The plane went completely silent as everyone waited for Marcus's response. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and they all knew it. What they didn't know was that the airline's corporate headquarters had just received an urgent alert about a PR disaster unfolding 35,000 feet. Marcus looked up at Rebecca, noting the tension in her face. Every passenger in the surrounding rows had gone silent, watching the scene unfold. The only sound was the steady hum of the airplane engines. A mistake. Marcus repeated calmly. His voice was quiet, but in the silence, everyone heard him clearly. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, aware of the phones recording her. Yes, Dr. Johnson, there was a misunderstanding about your seating assignment. Your first-class seat is still available. Marcus glanced around at the watching passengers. The woman by the window gave him an encouraging nod. The medical student who had been asking him questions whispered, They can't treat you like this. I see, Marcus said, turning back to Rebecca. And what exactly was the nature of this misunderstanding? Rebecca's cheeks flushed red. She hadn't expected him to question her. It was a system error. We apologize for the inconvenience. From 2 rows back, Sophia Chen called out. It wasn't a system error. I saw his boarding pass. It clearly showed first class. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Rebecca looked increasingly uncomfortable. Dr. Johnson, she said, lowering her voice, if you please come with me, the captain would like to personally apologize for the confusion. Marcus considered his options. Part of him wanted to refuse, to stay right where he was to make a point. But he was also aware that creating a scene would only make things more uncomfortable for everyone. All right, he said finally, gathering his briefcase. The heavy-set man in the aisle seat stood up without being asked, making way for Marcus. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, something unexpected happened. A passenger started to clap. Then another joined in. Within seconds, the entire economy section was applauding. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, both embarrassed and moved by the show of support. As Rebecca led him toward the front of the plane, passengers reached out to pat his shoulder or shake his hand. My daughter wants to be a neurosurgeon because of you, one woman told him as he passed. Your research saved my father's life, said another. By the time they reached the first-class cabin, Marcus was overwhelmed by the outpouring. The first-class passengers, who had witnessed his earlier removal, watched with various expressions as he returned. James Carter, the lead flight attendant, met them at the entrance to first class. "Dr. Johnson, on behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest apologies," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your first-class seat has been prepared for you, and we would like to offer you complimentary services for the remainder of your flight." As Marcus settled back into seat 3A, he noticed Rebecca hovering nearby, clearly struggling with what to say. "Dr. Johnson," she finally managed, "I'm truly sorry for the misunderstanding." Marcus looked at her directly. "Was it really a misunderstanding, Ms. Wilson, or was it an assumption you made about me when you saw me sitting here?" Rebecca's eyes dropped to the floor. She had no answer. In the cockpit, the captain was on a secure line with airline headquarters. The social media storm was growing by the minute. #Dr. Johnson deserves better was trending nationally, with celebrities and medical professionals weighing in. "It's bad," the airline's PR director was telling the captain. "Very bad. The passenger you've mistreated is not just any doctor. He's received the Presidential Medal for Medicine. He's operated on the children of senators and celebrities. And he sits on the board of 3 major hospitals." The captain closed his eyes, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What do you want us to do?" "Damage control, immediately. The CEO is preparing a public statement, but we need Dr. Johnson to leave this plane feeling respected. Whatever it takes." Back in first class, a different flight attendant approached Marcus with a glass of champagne and the airline's most expensive headphones. "Compliments of the captain, sir," she said with a genuine smile. The other first-class passengers watched with interest. The older woman who had spoken up earlier leaned forward. "I'm glad you're back where you belong, Doctor," she said warmly. Marcus thanked her, then closed his eyes, trying to process everything that had happened. His phone vibrated with notifications. Colleagues, friends, and even patients had somehow heard about the incident and were sending messages of support. The plane was only halfway to Los Angeles, and Marcus knew that when they landed, things would never be the same. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles. Marcus looked out the window at the sprawling city below, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. He had barely touched his champagne, his mind still processing the events of the flight. His phone, now in airplane mode, had been buzzing constantly before he turned it off. The incident had spread across social media like wildfire. Friends, colleagues, and even his hospital's PR department had been trying to reach him. James Carter, the lead flight attendant, approached his seat. "Dr. Johnson, I wanted to let you know that there will be a representative from our airline waiting to speak with you when we land." Marcus nodded. "Thank you for letting me know. Also," James continued, lowering his voice, "I want to personally apologize for what happened. It was unacceptable." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied simply. As the plane touched down at LAX, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Local time is 6:42 p.m. and the temperature is 72 degrees. We ask that you remain seated until we reach the gate." There was a brief pause before the captain continued. "And Dr. Marcus Johnson, if you're listening, the crew would like to extend our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding earlier in our flight. Thank you for your understanding and patience." The public acknowledgement surprised Marcus. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some nodding in approval at the captain's words. When the seatbelt sign turned off, James announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, as a courtesy to Dr. Johnson, we will be allowing him to deplane first." The first-class passengers applauded. Even more surprising, as Marcus walked through the economy section toward the exit, passengers stood up in respect. Some took photos, others simply nodded or smiled. The recognition was both heartwarming and uncomfortable for Marcus, who had always preferred to keep a low profile outside the operating room. At the jet bridge, a woman in a crisp suit waited. "Dr. Johnson, I'm Patricia Reynolds, Vice President of Customer Experience for the airline. Would you mind speaking with me privately for a moment?" Marcus glanced toward the terminal where he knew his wife would be waiting. "I can spare a few minutes." Patricia led him to a private lounge near the gate. Inside, a tall man in an expensive suit stood up as they entered. "Dr. Johnson, I'm Richard Campbell, CEO of the airline. I flew in from our headquarters as soon as I heard about this incident." Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. The CEO had clearly taken a private jet to meet him. Please understand, what happened today goes against everything our airline stands for, Richard continued. We've already begun a full investigation, and we're taking immediate steps to ensure nothing like this happens again. Patricia handed Marcus a folder. As a small token of our apology, we're offering you lifetime Platinum Elite status with our airline, as well as 500,000 frequent flyer miles. We've also made a donation in your name to the neurosurgery department at your hospital. Marcus opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. The donation was substantial, $250,000. While I appreciate the gesture, Marcus said carefully, what I'd really like to see is meaningful change in how your staff is trained. Richard nodded earnestly. Absolutely. We're already scheduling company-wide training on unconscious bias. In fact, we would be honored if you would consider consulting with us on this initiative. Outside the lounge, Sophia Chen from row 18 was waiting with several other passengers who had witnessed the incident. They had refused to leave until they saw how the airline was handling the situation. Through the glass walls of the lounge, they could see Marcus talking with the executives. Sophia's latest update had already been shared thousands of times. Airline CEO personally meets Dr. Johnson at LAX after discrimination incident. Change happening in real time. Inside the lounge, Marcus closed the folder. I appreciate your swift response, but meaningful change takes more than just words and money. Richard looked Marcus directly in the eyes. Tell us what you want to see happen, Dr. Johnson. We're listening. Marcus took a deep breath. What he said next would not only affect the airline but could potentially impact how companies across the country address similar issues. Behind him, through the terminal windows, the sun had fully set over Los Angeles, marking the end of a day that had started routinely but would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Marcus stood in his kitchen the next morning, cup of coffee in hand, watching the local news with his wife Elena. Their 2 teenage children had already left for school, unaware of what had happened to their father the previous day. And our top story this morning, the news anchor announced, renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Marcus Johnson was allegedly discriminated against on a flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles yesterday. The screen showed airport footage of Marcus speaking with airline executives, followed by social media posts about the incident. I still can't believe this happened, Elena said, squeezing his hand. As a civil rights attorney, she had wanted to immediately file a lawsuit, but Marcus had asked for time to think. His phone rang, the 5th call from the hospital's public relations department since he landed. This time he answered. Marcus, we need to discuss how to handle this, said Sarah Kim, the hospital's PR director. Every major news outlet is requesting interviews. The hospital board is calling an emergency meeting. This is getting bigger by the hour. I understand, Marcus replied calmly. I'll be in for the board meeting. As he hung up, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dr. Johnson, this is Rebecca Wilson from yesterday's flight. I got your number from customer relations. Please let me explain. Marcus showed the message to Elena, who frowned. You don't owe her anything. Maybe not, Marcus said thoughtfully, but I want to hear what she has to say. At the hospital, Marcus walked through the lobby to find staff and patients alike stopping to watch him pass. Some offered words of support, others simply nodded in solidarity. The incident had clearly touched a nerve with many people. The board meeting was held in a large conference room overlooking the city. Hospital administrators, legal counsel, and PR representatives filled the chairs around the table. Dr. Johnson, began Dr. Williams, the board chairman, while what happened to you is inexcusable, it has created an opportunity for important conversations about bias in our society. Sarah Kim jumped in. We've been flooded with interview requests. CNN, Good Morning America, The Today Show, they'd all want to talk to you about what happened. Marcus looked around the room. What exactly do you want me to do? We think you should tell your story, Dr. Williams replied. Not just what happened on that flight, but your journey as a black doctor in a field where you're still a minority. Your voice could make a real difference. Marcus had never sought the spotlight. His focus had always been his patients and his research, but he recognized that his experience reflected what many others face daily, without the protection of his status and credentials. After the meeting, Marcus found a quiet corner in the hospital garden. He called the number Rebecca had texted from. Dr. Johnson, She answered immediately, her voice nervous. "Thank you for calling back." "You wanted to explain," Marcus said simply. There was a long pause before Rebecca spoke. "I've been suspended pending investigation. I'll probably be fired." Her voice trembled. "But that's not why I'm calling. I want you to know that I've been thinking about what happened, really thinking about it." She continued, her words coming faster now. "I didn't see myself as someone who would do something like that. I have black friends. I never thought I was. But when I saw you in first class, something in me automatically assumed you didn't belong there. I didn't even realize I was doing it." Marcus remained silent, letting her speak. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to help me keep my job," Rebecca said. "I just wanted you to know that what happened has forced me to face some ugly truths about myself, and I'm going to work on that." As Marcus hung up, he noticed a group of young medical students watching him from across the garden. One of them, a young black woman, gave him a small wave. In that moment, Marcus made his decision. The airline's offer of money and status upgrades wasn't enough. Neither was the hospital's suggestion of interviews and speeches. What was needed was something more lasting, something that might prevent others from experiencing what he had. He pulled out his phone and called Richard Campbell, the airline CEO. "Mr. Campbell, I've been thinking about your question, about what I want to see happen. I think I have an answer now." 6 months later, Marcus stood at a podium in a large conference room at the airline's headquarters. Behind him was a banner that read, "The Johnson Initiative for Inclusive Travel." The room was filled with airline staff, executives, media representatives, and special guests. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, "I didn't expect to be at the center of a national conversation about bias and belonging. But sometimes, the most important journeys are the ones we never planned to take." In the front row sat Alina and their 2 children, alongside Dr. Williams from the hospital board. Rebecca Wilson was also present, seated quietly near the back of the room. "Today marks the official launch of a program that will train over 20,000 airline employees across the country," Marcus continued. "But this initiative isn't just about one incident or one airline. It's about recognizing that small moments of bias can have profound impacts on people's lives and dignity." The Johnson Initiative had evolved far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Instead of pursuing legal action or accepting the airline's original offer, Marcus had worked with Richard Campbell to create something meaningful. The airline had committed $5 million to develop a comprehensive training program that would be shared across the entire industry. "We've created a curriculum that doesn't shame or blame," Marcus explained, showing slides of the training materials. "Instead, it helps people recognize unconscious patterns and change them before they lead to harmful actions." In the months since the incident, Marcus had become an unexpected voice in conversations about bias in everyday interactions. His calm demeanor and focus on solutions rather than punishment had resonated with people across the political spectrum. "What makes this program different," Richard Campbell added, joining Marcus at the podium, "is that it was developed with input from our own employees, including those who've experienced bias firsthand. And yes, that includes Rebecca Wilson." There was a murmur in the audience as some turned to look at Rebecca. She had not been fired as expected. Instead, after several honest conversations with Marcus, she had become an important contributor to the training program, sharing her perspective on how unconscious bias had influenced her actions that day. Rebecca's willingness to examine her own thinking and help others do the same has been invaluable, Marcus acknowledged, nodding in her direction. After the presentation, as people mingled during the reception, a young flight attendant approached Marcus. "Dr. Johnson, I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I'm new to the airline, and your program was part of my training. It changed how I see things, how I see people." Throughout the room, similar conversations were taking place. Airline staff shared stories of how the training had affected their interactions with passengers. Executives from other airlines discussed implementing similar programs. Near the refreshment table, Rebecca approached Marcus cautiously. "I never thought something positive could come from my worst mistake," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "That's the thing about mistakes. They're only truly wasted if we don't learn from them." As the event wound down, a reporter asked Marcus if he felt justice had been served. "Justice isn't always about punishment," Marcus replied thoughtfully. Sometimes it's about creating change that prevents others from experiencing the same harm. If one person is treated with more dignity because of this initiative, then yes, I believe justice has been served. Later that evening, as Marcus and his family drove home, his son asked, "Dad, are you glad that it happened? The thing on the plane?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "I'm not glad it happened," he finally answered. "But I am grateful for what came after, the conversations, the changes, the connections with people I might never have met otherwise." He glanced at Elena, who smiled at him with pride. Sometimes, Marcus continued, it's not about what happens to you, but what you choose to do with it that matters most. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus noticed a new family moving in across the street. Without hesitation, he walked over to introduce himself. Just Dr. Marcus Johnson, their new neighbor, ready to start fresh with no assumptions, no judgments, just the simple dignity of human connection.